Um, but they're typically made, the smaller pari that we're used to seeing that survived into the 20th century, were made with a hide or metal base, and then it's reinforced with rings of steel in a particular pattern. There's a squarish boss, which kind of makes like a star-shaped pattern,
Yeah.
with limbs that go out to the rim. There's typically typically four more arms that get layered underneath that, and then 1, 2, or 3 concentric rings, which are all riveted together, riveted to the base plate, right? And then often the edge is rolled over, linking those as well, if it's made from steel. And then on the back, we see typically like a felt pad. Because of the way it's gripped, you're punching it effectively and it's flat. So a little bit of padding here helps absorb impact. And then the grip is done. There's 4 anchor points surrounding the hand with pins, like cotter pins, that go through. And leather strap is woven through these and then twisted around itself to form a handle in the middle, that's sized to the user. So your hand goes in and grips firmly.
Interesting. And so did I understand you correctly? The base of it is hide, or the base of the shield is hide?
It can be hide or it can be metal.
Oh, okay.
Depends on how wealthy you were and you know, what you had access to when that one was made.
Okay. What kind of hide?
So typically the heaviest you could get and boiled and hardened. So it would be, you know, the thick part of a pig skin or the thick part of an ox hide. You know, it's not going to be your fine, nice hide. They raised a lot of sheep in the Highlands. They're not going to use that for the buckler, right? They're going to use the, you know, the draft ox that's tough as nails.
Okay.
You know, the same thing you'd make your shoes out of.
Okay. And then the metal parts were made of steel, right?
Steel, iron, mostly one of those two, again, depending on the period, depending on what they had access to.
And copper, have you seen copper ones?
No, I have not. I have not seen a surviving copper one, not in the Highlands. I've seen copper and bronze, you know, parts for shields this way from archaeological excavations, but nothing, you know, surviving intact. What I have seen copper in is that, especially in later period, people would repair their mail with bits of copper wire. If they lost rings and were in a hurry, they'd snip a bit of copper wire from somewhere and make another ring out of it.
Okay, that's right. Okay, and so, and have you ever seen any pari with a central spike in it? That they put a spike?
Not so much on the pari. There's sort of a knob. There's a slight bump on that faceplate typically, but you know, maybe a half-inch kind of dome just to create another little area and strengthen it by your hand. But no, we don't really see the pari that way. Now in lowland Georgia, where we see much more, you know, Persian or Byzantine import in goods, right, where you didn't necessarily make it yourself. You might have bought a really nice shield, you know, from Persia or from Byzantium. There we see things that look more domed, sometimes with a central spike, sometimes conical. But again, even then, that really starts to take off like the 14th century. You know, before that, Georgia, we see a lot of sort of kite shields and heater shields, much more influenced by their participation in the Crusades and Western Europe. And we see a lot of the sort of Byzantine kite, you know, that small, elongated, you know, sort of almost egg-shaped shield.
And how did they protect their arms and their hands? What did they use?
So on the hands, they tended to use mail mittens. So you'd have a hide mitten, and you would sew bits of mail to it. The left one, the mail would run up to these knuckles and then pick up again here and on the thumb. And this would just be hide because it was up against your buckler. The right one, it would be mail all the way down, and then they would wrap. For the forearms, they used what the Georgians call samklaveni, or in Persian, bazubans, right? Typically in Khevsur, these were a three-part construction. So you had the one long plate that came up to your elbow, and then on the inside, two smaller plates, which were linked together via mail rings, the same rings you made your mail out of, and then leather straps to close.
So they were separated, correct? Not like bazuban, which they were attached, the mittens and the bazuban.
No. It tended to be separate hand protection, and the mittens would come and they would have a spot that would double wrap underneath here, and then you would put your samklaveni, your arm protection, on over it.
Yes.
So you can think of it like the form without the back of hand protection.
Yeah.
We see Persian style bazubans with back of hand, again, down in the lowlands where people had the money to import things. Up in the highlands, if you had something like that, you probably took it off of somebody you killed.
Okay.
You didn't have the money for that. The local construction was simpler, and very often would be edged and decorated in brass. So it would be a steel or iron base, and rather than like the wrist would be rolled, you'd spend the time to do that for strength, and then up along the back edges you would reinforce it by riveting a thin strip of brass to it, and that brass was often engraved or would have calligraphy engraved in it. The Khevsur liked to decorate everything. I think you get bored in the mountains in the winter, and you can carve things and engrave them.
Oh, okay. Okay, and let's go to the legs. How did they protect their knees and their legs?
So, I mean, the hauberk itself, hung low, right? Almost to the knee in many cases.
Yeah.
But the most common leg protection we would see, again, the same heavy wool pants that we saw, the tunic made from. And there would be over wraps, again, heavily embroidered for the calf, right? So you'd wear your shoes and your heavy socks, and then you'd wrap these like heavily embroidered gaiters over those. And then some people would have like mail trousers that covered the outside and the front of the leg. And then you might see then also with those small rigid circles for the knees. But most commonly the Khevsur were lightly armored, and it was, cloth armor on the legs. Rarely do we see anything more than mail. And again, the hauberk would come down almost to the knee. So really it was from the knee down you were worried about, armoring.
Okay, perfect. So have you seen any Georgian armor made of integrated plate in the mail, like Joshan?
Yeah, like we see in Persia, like we see in Russia so heavily. Yeah. In the lowlands, some. But in the highlands, not really. The highlands were pure mail, as far as we can tell. At least if there were other things, it wasn't recorded really. I mean, I would imagine some Georgian, took some off of somebody once, but it wasn't a style in the highlands. In lowland Georgia, more so, but in lowland Georgia, they seem to have favored scale and lamellar armors, akin to the Byzantines. So we see much more of the sort of Byzantine, overlapping scales in one type or another as heavier armor in the lowlands. Occasionally we see 4 mirrors style plate, but not so much embedded plates. There is one particular shirt from a Georgian king in the museum in Tbilisi, I believe, that has like embedded jewel mounts in places in the mail. But honestly, it looks more like bling than anything meant to be extra protective. You know, they're not large plates with jewels in them. They're small, you know, almost ring mount jewels that are just attached into the mail in a few places. You know, really probably for identification. You can tell who the leader is because he's the guy wearing the fancy mail.
Okay, perfect. And so did I, and just one step back, they used bazuband for both arms, correct? Okay, this one.
Correct.
And did they use any extra shoulder protection made of metal?
Not in the Highlands.
Not
In the Highlands, they literally fought in mail. And the style of fight reflects it, right? Where the armored fighting with Shamshir and Separ, that you guys do it in Razmafzar, tends to be sort of a neutral fight, I would say. It's aggressive but also defensive. In the Khevsur art, as far as I can tell, and as far as all the legends are, you keep yourself safe by basically being a rabid Wolverine. You go so hard at the other guy, he doesn't have time to hit you. And so they're very mobile. Level shifts are done heavily. The Khevsur will fight from a squatting position or kneeling position, right? So you have a shield that's in the way. I strike at your head really hard, you know, once, maybe twice to draw your defenses up. And as soon as your Shamshir and Separ are up, I make that strike. And this time I pull through. It's literally sinking my whole weight to the ground and thrust up behind, right? So they make use of that vertical movement a lot. It's a very highly mobile style. Even the buckler itself is highly, highly mobile. A lot of people who fence buckler, especially in the HEMA community, the more popular styles of bucklers you'll see are 133 or Bolognese, right? The Western sources. And there's this concept there that you keep they protect, the buckler gets used to protect the sword hand in 133. And in Bolognese, it kind of controls an area of space. You kind of hold it out and block. The Khevsur don't use the buckler that way. If it's closer to 133, but there the truism is that the buckler is always supporting the sword. There is a Khevsur folk saying that says, you know, the sword or Kamali goes to work, the pari blazes the path. The buckler is used in a highly aggressive manner to clear, to make openings for me to strike through. And that kind of encompasses the entire philosophy of Khevsur fighting. You'll defend yourself, but you know, it's the best defense is a good offense.
I mean,
right?
it's
Use
very
my tools in
interesting
concert.
because in a Persian style, I mean, it's the same thing actually, because the Persian style is with the very aggressive strikes, and the shield opens, and then you strike with the shamshir. Excuse me, the separ opens, and then you strike with the shamshir. And you see, for example, in tons of miniatures. Don't forget about the manuscripts of battle accounts, where people are clearing, shamshir is there, where people are there, shamshir is there, and so you have thousands of Persian miniatures showing it, right? You never seen Persian miniatures the way these guys fight, right? So because Shamshir is a heavy cutter, and many people who have never ever handled a real Shamshir in their hand, besides the qualities of steel, is a heavy cutter, And I think what you said about Georgian swordsmanship, it is again, these things which Frank did in one of the videos, this transfer of HEMA, but it has old tradition. So the Europeans were doing it this way. So let's judge the rest of the world because we did it this way, you know? But I mean,
well, and it's really misleading when you look at the Georgian stuff, because if you look at what Elashvili documents, the main covers and guard positions in Georgian fall into a handful of categories. And the primary defensive positions act with my hands joined, right? My buckler hand and my sword hand snugs up next to it. and I may literally overlap my thumbs to lock them together to absorb a strong blow. But the defensive action in Khevsur swordplay becomes this punch, this counter punch, where I structure my whole body to absorb that strike with these two linked. And I want to take the blow on the edge of the buckler and use my sword to trap yours, right? If at that point I can transfer you, I've caught you between the two, now I can twist my buckler forward, locking your sword out of the way and make a counter strike. The basic actions in a friendly bout. So this is one of the really neat cultural bits about the Georgian stuff, is that we know of 3 distinct, like, sanctioned violence levels of fencing. At its simplest and friendliest, we have Parikaoba. Parikaoba you can think of as we're showing off at the feast. We turn our swords, we fence with the backs of the swords, we don't thrust at all. We are just showing off our skills. The next step up is treatises. Treatises or troba, also known is the sort you use to settle quarrels without blood feud, right? You don't want to kill somebody because that gets really expensive. Now we're fencing for earnest, but we're trying not to kill each other, right? We're just trying to show that we're dominant, inflict a light bleeding wound, usually inside the hairline. And that's how we settle a quarrel. Then there's Elashvili. Elashvili is, the kingdom is under attack, we're at war, I will do anything to anybody, right? And we see this, that in the friendlier levels, the hands stay joined. The cuts are light. The goal is to show expertise by inflicting a cutting wound, but not seriously injuring the other person. When we get to Elashvili, we go from everything being here to, even Elashvili shows 2 separated guards with my buckler held out and my sword back here. But there's 2 others. Elashvili did not preserve these, but they were preserved for us in some early Soviet, some other texts, which will look very familiar to you. If I'm from here and I want to generate power, my buckler goes forward and my hand rolls up and cuts back. Right? And I've seen your guys do something very similar, rolling the shamshir through and striking out. You know, and then the same thing on the other side. And then lastly, because they favored a straight or slightly curved sword, there's another guard that's analogous to what you see in your stuff, where the buckler is held out and the point of the sword is hidden, in the case of the Georgian, right behind the buckler. So if I frame it correctly, you can't see my sword. You don't know where it's going to come from.
Okay, talking about that, let's go to the sword you use. What kind of sword do you use in your style?